The first frost of autumn had settled across the hills of Blackwood, turning the fields silver beneath a pale evening sky. The great manor stood atop the ridge like an ancient guardian, its tall stone towers outlined against the fading light. Warm lanterns glowed behind hundreds of windows, yet the estate felt strangely quiet, as though it carried a sorrow too heavy for laughter. A lone carriage stopped before the wrought iron gates. A young woman stepped down, carrying nothing more than a weathered leather satchel and a folded letter of recommendation. Her gray traveling cloak was damp from the long journey, and the hem of her simple dress bore the dust of many miles. Though exhaustion shadowed her face, she held herself with quiet dignity. Her name was Eleanor Ashford. Only 2 months earlier, she had been caring for her aging father in the modest country cottage where she had spent her childhood. Once, the Ashford family had belonged to the respectable gentry, but years of poor harvests, mounting debts, and illness had stripped away nearly everything except their honor. When her father passed away, creditors claimed the cottage and every possession inside it. Left with little more than her education and unwavering determination, Eleanor searched for respectable employment. She could read French, play the piano, teach literature, and manage correspondence. Those talents had earned her a recommendation to Blackwood Manor, where the Duke was said to be seeking a companion for his younger sister. She paused at the gate and looked toward the magnificent estate. "I only need one chance," she whispered. As if answering her words, footsteps approached along the gravel path. A tall man emerged from the shadows, carrying a stable lantern. He wore rough working clothes, leather boots stained with mud, and a plain wool coat. His dark hair was slightly untidy, and a day's worth of stubble softened the sharp lines of his face. Though dressed like an ordinary estate worker, there was something unmistakably composed about him. His posture was straight, his voice calm, and his blue eyes seemed to notice everything. "You must be Miss Ashford," he said. Eleanor smiled politely. "I am. I hope I haven't arrived too late." "Not at all." He reached for her satchel before she could protest. "The roads are difficult after sunset. You don't have to carry it. It doesn't weigh much." She thanked him as they walked together through the quiet grounds. Fallen leaves danced across the stone path, while cool evening air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. "My name is Thomas," the man said. "I help wherever the estate requires." Eleanor nodded. "It must be a beautiful place to work." "It can be." His answer carried a thoughtful note that she didn't fully understand. They crossed the courtyard, where servants hurried about preparing the manor for the evening meal. Several greeted Thomas with unusual respect before quickly looking away. Eleanor noticed it, but assumed he was simply well-liked. Neither she nor anyone else knew that Thomas did not exist. The man beside her was Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood. For nearly a year, he had occasionally exchanged his tailored coats for simple work clothes whenever new employees arrived. Wealth attracted flattering smiles and carefully rehearsed manners. Disguise revealed what titles concealed. He trusted honesty more than appearances. Especially now. Everything had changed after the accident. 5 years earlier, his younger sister Clara had been returning from a charity concert when frightened horses overturned her carriage on a rain-soaked road. Though she survived, her eyesight never returned. Doctors came from London, specialists from Edinburgh. Foreign physicians recommended impossible treatments. Nothing restored her vision. The physical injury healed, but loneliness remained. Companions hired to comfort her rarely stayed long. Some pitied her openly. Others treated her like a helpless child. A few were interested only in earning favor with the Duke. Each disappointment made Clara quieter. Each farewell convinced Alexander that genuine kindness had become impossible to recognize. That was why Eleanor's arrival mattered. She simply didn't know she was being observed from the moment she entered the gates. Inside the manor, the housekeeper welcomed Eleanor warmly before leading her toward a bright sitting room. "Lady Clara is waiting," she said. "Please, don't feel nervous." Eleanor took a slow breath before stepping inside. A young woman sat beside a tall window, her fingers resting lightly on an embroidery frame she could no longer see. Golden hair framed a gentle face turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. "You must be Miss Ashford," Clara said with a soft smile. "I am honored to meet you, my lady." Clara laughed quietly. "I've had enough people bowing today. Please sit." Eleanor did. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. Many companions began with awkward apologies or unnecessary sympathy. Eleanor did something different. "I heard there's a remarkable rose garden behind the western terrace." "There is," Clara answered. "I've never seen it. Would you describe it to me someday?" Clara blinked in surprise. "You're going to ask whether I miss seeing it?" "No. Why not?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Because I imagine everyone asks that." "They do. I would rather ask what you'd like to remember or discover." Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Hopeful silence. For the first time in many months, Clara felt someone speaking to her rather than about her. They spent the next hour discussing books they both loved. Poetry, music, travel, childhood memories. They argued playfully over which composer wrote the most moving melodies and laughed over amusing scenes from classic novels. Not once did Eleanor treat Clara as fragile. Not once did she offer empty pity. When tea arrived, Eleanor quietly asked, "Would you like me to move the cup closer, or would you prefer to reach for it yourself?" Clara smiled. "Thank you for asking. My father valued independence deeply," Eleanor replied. "He taught me never to assume what another person needs." Outside the half-open doorway, Alexander stood unnoticed. He had intended to watch for only a moment. Instead, he remained there for nearly an hour. Every conversation felt natural. Every kindness seemed effortless. Nothing about Eleanor appeared practiced. Later that evening, Clara asked whether they might walk through the gardens before bed. The moon had risen, bathing the estate in silver light. Since Clara could no longer see the landscape she had loved since childhood, Eleanor described every detail with gentle precision. "The fountain is sparkling like scattered diamonds," she said softly. "The roses have almost finished blooming, but one white flower is still standing. The oak trees are swaying just enough to whisper to one another. Above them, the moon is so bright that the paths look as though they've been dusted with silver." Clara closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost see it again. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "Beautiful," she whispered. Hidden beneath the shadow of an old oak tree, Alexander watched in silence. He had spent years searching for someone who could ease his sister's loneliness. Yet no physician, no companion, and no noble visitor had accomplished in years what Eleanor Ashford had achieved in a single evening. As he watched his sister smile beneath the moonlight, something unexpected stirred within his own heart. He had hidden his name to discover the truth about another person. Instead, before the first night had ended, he had begun discovering the truth about himself. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, bathing the marble halls in warm gold. For the first time in many months, the house seemed lighter. Servants noticed Lady Clara humming softly as she walked through the corridors with a confidence they had almost forgotten. The melancholy that had settled over the estate since her accident was beginning to lift. The change had a name: Eleanor Ashford. Within a week of her arrival, she had become more than a companion. She became a trusted friend. Instead of spending long hours indoors, Eleanor encouraged Clara to rediscover the world through her remaining senses. Every morning, they wandered through the gardens before breakfast. Eleanor would gently place different flowers into Clara's hands. "This one is a rose," Eleanor would say. "Feel how the petals fold like silk. The fragrance is sweet, but there's a sharpness beneath it. And this one, lavender. Rub the blossoms between your fingers." Clara smiled as the calming scent drifted through the air. "I think I like this one best." They laughed together like sisters. One afternoon, Eleanor led Clara to the orchard, where autumn apples hung heavily from the branches. Rather than guiding her every step, Eleanor allowed Clara to move at her own pace, offering an arm only when asked. "You never make me feel helpless," Clara admitted. Eleanor looked at her thoughtfully. "Because you're not helpless. Losing your sight has changed how you experience the world, not who you are." Those simple words settled deep within Clara's heart. Hidden behind the branches nearby, Alexander heard every word. He had intended only to inspect the orchard, yet once again he found himself quietly watching Eleanor. Each passing day confirmed what he had first witnessed on her arrival. Her kindness asked for nothing in return. Still wearing the identity of Thomas, he continued helping around the estate, allowing himself opportunities to speak with her. One afternoon, he found Eleanor sitting beneath an ancient oak tree with a book resting on her lap. "You always seem to be reading," he remarked. She looked up with an amused smile. "And you always seem to appear when I least expect it. I'll apologize if I'm interrupting." "You aren't." He settled onto the grass a respectful distance away. "What are you reading?" "Persuasion. I've never had much patience for novels." "I don't believe you." "Why not?" "You ask too many thoughtful questions to dislike stories." Alexander laughed. "You've caught me." Their conversations soon became the brightest part of each day. Sometimes they debated poetry. Sometimes they discussed history or music. Other times they simply sat together in comfortable silence, listening to birds singing high above the gardens. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself speaking openly, not as a duke expected to maintain perfect composure, but as an ordinary man. "What would you do," he asked one evening, "if you suddenly became wealthy?" Eleanor considered the question. "I would make certain no child in the nearby villages went without books. No jewels. They're beautiful. No grand carriage. They're comfortable. No London mansion." She smiled. "I've lived in enough houses to know walls don't create happiness. Kindness does." Her answer lingered with Alexander long after they parted. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people eager to praise wealth and titles. Eleanor was the first person he had ever met who spoke of compassion with greater admiration than fortune. Without realizing it, he was falling in love. The servants noticed it before he did. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, observed the Duke lingering near the gardens whenever Eleanor was there. The head gardener chuckled whenever Thomas suddenly volunteered for work in places Eleanor happened to visit. Even the elderly butler smiled knowingly. No one dared mention it. Meanwhile, Clara noticed something else. "You like Thomas," she teased one afternoon as Eleanor helped organize sheet music in the music room. Eleanor nearly dropped the stack in her hands. "What? You smile differently when he's nearby." "I do not." "You absolutely do." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "He's simply pleasant company. And handsome. I hadn't noticed." "Liar." Both women burst into laughter. Although Eleanor refused to admit it aloud, Clara had spoken the truth. Thomas possessed a quiet strength unlike anyone she had known. He listened carefully before speaking. He treated every servant with respect. He never boasted or sought admiration. Most importantly, he seemed to understand loneliness. Whenever they spoke, she forgot the uncertainty of her future. Alexander experienced the same comfort. Yet each happy conversation deepened his guilt. Every smile Eleanor offered belonged to Thomas. Not Alexander Blackwood. Not the Duke. The deception that had once seemed harmless now weighed heavily upon him. One afternoon, a line of elegant carriages rolled through the manor gates. The Ashcombe family had arrived. Lord Ashcombe was an influential nobleman whose greatest ambition was to see his daughter, Lady Beatrice, become Duchess of Blackwood. Beatrice entered the manor wearing an extravagant emerald gown, sparkling diamonds, and an expression of practiced superiority. She greeted servants without learning their names. She complimented the manor while criticizing its decorations. Then she met Clara. "My dear Lady Clara," she said with exaggerated sympathy. "How tragic your condition must be." Clara forced a polite smile. "I manage quite well." "I'm certain you do." The words sounded kind. The tone did not. Eleanor recognized the difference immediately. Throughout dinner, Beatrice monopolized every conversation, speaking endlessly about London society, expensive gowns, and prestigious family connections. Whenever Clara attempted to contribute, Beatrice interrupted. At last Eleanor spoke. I believe Lady Clara was finishing her thought. The dining room fell silent. Beatrice smiled thinly. "Of course." Clara reached beneath the table and gently squeezed Eleanor's hand in gratitude. Alexander watched the exchange from the opposite end of the table. His admiration for Eleanor deepened. Later that evening, an unexpected messenger arrived from one of the Duke's neighboring estates. A bridge had partially collapsed after heavy rain, leaving several farming families stranded. The steward hurried into the drawing room. "My lord," he said urgently, forgetting Eleanor was present, "your immediate decision is required." The room became perfectly still. Several servants instinctively bowed. Lady Beatrice straightened in her chair. Eleanor looked from the steward to Thomas. Confusion filled her eyes. "My lord!" Alexander slowly stood. His shoulders straightened with natural authority, and the humble, stable hand vanished. Before her stood the Duke of Blackwood, the master of the estate. "I'll leave at once," he instructed calmly. "Organize repair crews and ensure every family receives food and shelter before nightfall." "Yes, your grace." The servants hurried away. Silence remained. Eleanor stared at him, unable to speak. "You," she whispered. Alexander stepped toward her. "Eleanor." "No." She took a slow step backward. "Thomas doesn't exist." Pain flickered across his face. "I can explain. You watched me." "Yes." "You let me trust you." "I never meant." "You let me believe you were someone else." The hurt in her voice was sharper than anger. Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked from the room. Alexander remained where he stood, realizing that the disguise he had created to uncover honesty had cost him the one honest heart he had come to cherish. For the first time since meeting Eleanor Ashford, the Duke of Blackwood feared that he had lost something far more precious than a secret. Rain fell gently over Blackwood Manor the morning after Eleanor discovered Thomas's true identity. Gray clouds drifted low across the hills, wrapping the estate in silence. The cheerful laughter that had recently returned to the manor seemed to have disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Eleanor stood beside the window of her small room, folding the last of her belongings into the worn leather satchel she had carried when she first arrived. There was little to pack: a few dresses, several treasured books, and a notebook in which she had written poems and observations during her stay. She paused when she reached the small pressed sprig of lavender Clara had given her after their first walk through the gardens. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Leaving Clara would break her heart, but staying felt impossible. Every conversation she had shared with Thomas now echoed differently in her mind. The laughter, the quiet walks beneath the oak tree, the honest discussions about life and kindness. None of them had been false, yet all of them had been built upon a secret. A gentle knock sounded at her door. "Come in," Eleanor said softly. Clara stepped inside, carefully finding her way with practiced confidence. "I knew you would be packing," Clara whispered. Eleanor tried to smile. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." Clara reached out until she found Eleanor's hands. "Please don't go." Eleanor's voice trembled. "I don't know how to stay. My brother never meant to hurt you. He let me believe he trusted me as an equal." "He did trust you." "No," Eleanor replied quietly. "He tested me." Clara lowered her head. "I told him years ago that one day someone would teach him the difference between caution and fear." "What do you mean?" "He stopped believing people could be good unless they proved it first." Eleanor remained silent. "He disguised himself because so many people wanted the Duke," Clara continued. Very few cared about Alexander. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "I wish he had believed I deserved the truth." Before Clara could answer, footsteps approached in the hallway. Alexander stopped outside the open doorway. "I'll leave if you wish," he said. Clara gently squeezed Eleanor's hand before quietly leaving the room, closing the door behind her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Alexander looked nothing like the stable hand she had known. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat embroidered with the crest of Blackwood, he carried all the dignity expected of one of England's most respected dukes. Yet his eyes held the same sincerity she had come to know. "I owe you an apology," he began. "You owe me honesty." "You're right." He took a slow breath. "When Clara lost her sight, people changed. Some pitied her because they wanted praise. Others pretended kindness because they hoped for my favor. Every companion I hired disappointed her." His voice grew quieter. "I stopped trusting appearances. So you decided No one deserved your trust until they passed your test. I thought I was protecting my sister. And were you? Alexander lowered his eyes. No, I was protecting myself. The admission hung heavily between them. I watched you describe the moonlit garden to Clara on your first night, he continued. You made her smile in a way I hadn't seen for years. Every day after that, I wanted to tell you who I really was. What stopped you? I was afraid. She looked at him with surprise. The Duke of Blackwood, afraid? Not of losing my title. He met her gaze. Of losing you. Eleanor's heart ached. She believed every word. Yet trust, once broken, cannot be restored by confession alone. I need time, she whispered. Alexander nodded. I understand. He stepped aside, allowing her to leave if she chose. She quietly picked up her satchel and walked past him. Neither noticed Clara standing silently in the hallway, tears slipping down her cheeks. Word spread quickly through neighboring estates that the mysterious young companion was leaving Blackwood Manor. Before long, the gossip reached Lord Ashcombe and his ambitious daughter, Lady Beatrice. They wasted no time twisting the story. I always suspected she hoped to marry above her station, Beatrice remarked loudly during a charity gathering in the nearby village. When she discovered she could not deceive the Duke, she fled. Several guests murmured in agreement. The cruel rumor traveled from drawing rooms to marketplaces until even strangers spoke Eleanor's name with suspicion. When friends urged her to defend herself, Eleanor quietly refused. The truth doesn't become stronger because I argue louder, she said. She accepted a modest teaching position in a village several miles from Blackwood and devoted herself to educating children who had never before owned books of their own. Meanwhile, Alexander threw himself into estate duties, but nothing filled the emptiness Eleanor had left behind. The gardens no longer drew his attention. The old oak tree stood untouched. Even Clara noticed that her brother smiled less each passing week. 1 month later, Blackwood Manor hosted its annual charity concert to raise money for hospitals and schools. Nobles from across the county gathered in the grand ballroom, including Lord Ashcombe and Lady Beatrice. Alexander attended only because tradition demanded it. He expected another evening of polite conversation and forced smiles. Instead, Clara surprised everyone. When the orchestra finished its opening performance, she rose from her chair and walked confidently onto the stage. The ballroom fell silent. I cannot see your faces, Clara began, but I know many of you have heard stories about Miss Eleanor Ashford. Whispers swept through the crowd. I wish to tell you what truly happened. She spoke with remarkable courage. She described Eleanor's first evening at the manor, how Eleanor had asked permission before offering help, how she had described flowers, music, rain, and moonlight with such beauty that darkness no longer felt empty. Most importantly, Clara revealed the truth. The woman some accused of chasing a duke's fortune did not even know she was speaking to a duke. She believed my brother was an ordinary stable hand. She showed kindness before she knew his name, before she knew his title, and before she knew he possessed anything worth envying. Silence filled the grand hall. Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Lord Ashcombe said nothing. Alexander stepped onto the stage beside his sister. Looking across the gathered guests, he spoke with complete honesty. I believed disguising my name would reveal another person's character. He paused. Instead, it revealed the flaws in my own. The following morning, he rode alone to the small village school where Eleanor now taught. Children's laughter drifted through the open windows. When lessons ended, Eleanor walked outside, carrying a basket of books. She stopped in surprise when she saw Alexander waiting beneath an old oak tree. He removed his hat. I've come without guards. She smiled faintly. And without disguises. Never again. He stepped closer. I cannot erase the pain I caused. No, but I hope I can spend the rest of my life proving I have learned from it. He reached into his coat and produced a simple silver ring, not adorned with diamonds or royal crests, but engraved with a single blooming rose. The first evening we met, you gave my sister hope. Before dawn, you unknowingly gave me something I thought I had lost forever. What was that? Faith. His voice softened. I don't ask you to marry the Duke of Blackwood." He gently held out the ring. I asked whether Eleanor Ashford might give Alexander another chance. Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes. This time, there were no hidden names, no secret tests, only truth. She stepped forward and placed her hand in his. "I forgive you, Alexander." A smile spread across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Several months later, the bells of the village church rang joyfully across the valley. The wedding was elegant but intimate. The front pews were filled not with the most powerful nobles in England, but with the estate workers, gardeners, teachers, and villagers whose lives had been touched by the couple's kindness. Clara performed a beautiful piano piece during the ceremony, earning a standing ovation from every guest. Inspired by Eleanor, she later founded a music school where blind and sighted children learned side by side, proving that talent needed opportunity, not pity, to flourish. As evening settled over Blackwood Manor, Alexander and Eleanor walked once more through the moonlit garden where their story had truly begun. The fountain shimmered like silver beneath the stars. One white rose still bloomed beside the path. Alexander smiled as Eleanor began describing the peaceful scene to Clara, just as she had on her very first night at the manor. He realized then that titles could command respect, wealth could purchase comfort, and power could shape kingdoms. But only compassion could transform a heart. And on the night a young woman had spoken gently to a blind stranger, a duke had unknowingly found the greatest treasure of his life.